Hi, welcome to our webinar from the Society for the Advancement of Consulting on reshoring in a post-COVID world, with our first in a series of two webinars on this topic with a global supply chain expert panel. So we're very excited to have this group with us. We're going to focus in our first panel on North America and the Pacific Rim. And the second panel, which is going to be on November 11th, is going to be focused on North America and Europe, as that's where our panelists are from. So in today's panel, I'm Lisa Anderson, and I'm the moderator from Claremont, California. I am the co-executive director of the Society for Advancement of Consulting, and I'm president of LMA Consulting Group. And we have Evan Bulmer, who is from the PAC Rim and is from Australia. He's an expert in finance as well as manufacturing and supply chain. We have David Ogilvie from the PAC Rim as well, from Brisbane, Australia. And he is an expert in supply chain and ERP. We have Rick Pay, who is from North America, from Portland, Oregon. And Rick is an expert in manufacturing and supply chain and works with companies throughout the US. And we have Dave Gardner, who's from Santa Clara, California, who is an expert in configure to order, mass customization, and manufacturing. And we have Diane Garcia, who is also from Portland, Oregon. And Diane is an expert in sales and operations planning and manufacturing and supply chain. So we have a great group of experts to talk about reshoring in a post-COVID world, which is definitely a hot topic of the day. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can see us all on the screen as we get going. If you're in the audience, please send us questions. We love to make this interactive through Q&A or the chat box, so that we can, and I will intersperse them in so that we can have a discussion. As we found out in our practice round, there is a lot to talk about and a lot of debate we could have on this topic. So it should stimulate some interesting conversations. So to kick it off, I'd like to talk about a Kearney study. The annual reshoring index showed that in 2019, pre-COVID, that there was a dramatic reversal in the 5-year trend, with folks starting to reshore to the United States. And it was spurred on by the tariffs. However, actually the Amazon effect came into play, as well, as customers are demanding rapid deliveries, and they do not care about our issues and what we have to go through to get them from far-flung places. And this is from a North America perspective. And then also on the labor component of total cost is going down as we automate and utilize technology, and people are starting to look at the total cost of ownership. So with the Kearney study in hand, as we get into COVID, it really has put, we've hit the speed button, if you will, on this topic. So now everyone is talking about reshoring. According to a Thomas survey, 64% of manufacturers are taking action, which is different from thinking about it. They are taking action on reshoring. So, and from a client's point of view, I'm seeing inquiries coming to clients that are well positioned to take on volume from a reshoring point of view. And I also have a plethora of clients reevaluating their sourcing networks and thinking about where they should go. So it is absolutely a hot topic in this environment. And so with that said, I'm going to turn it over to each of our panelists to do a brief intro from their point of view on reshoring, like a minute each, and then we'll start digging into some of these topics in more detail. So I think with that said, let's start with Rick Pay. Why don't you go ahead and give us your perspective?
Yes, just this morning, I was listening to some business television announcers, and they were interviewing the CEO of Mattel Corporation. And he mentioned that they have completely restructured their supply chains as a result of COVID in particular, and that they've saved over 1,000 basis points in their gross profit margin. And it's largely been through a rationalization and regionalization of their supply chain. They've actually moved a fair amount of it back to North America, not only the US, but Canada and Mexico. And then they've also moved some to India and other countries in Southeast Asia, as well as leaving some in China. I think the bottom line of his comments that really rang true with me is that number one, they did simplify their supply chains. They had a fairly complex network in the past, and by reducing the number of suppliers, the number of parts, the number of items that they source, they helped quite a bit. And then they regionalized their supply chain. So reshoring is a piece of that, but it's also a shifting to make sure that your supply chains are as short as possible, that you can take advantage of speed, reduce risk, improve your partnerships with your suppliers, and give strong consideration to growth as you go forward. So the reshoring piece, the regionalization piece is a very key component of their extremely successful supply chain re-strategizing.
Very good. Well, we have lots to explore further with those comments. Diane, how about you? What are you seeing in terms of reshoring?
Similar to what Rick mentioned, I have clients, manufacturing and distribution clients, who are, not only thinking, but are taking action. Those are maybe already ahead of the game or ahead of the curve, and it's also not only impacted from tariffs and other trends like that, but also from the e-commerce trend. So you have a lot of clients of mine that are just really considering, what they need to do to meet customer expectations, and how do they have a resilient supply chain. So this will be a fun panel. I'm glad to be here. Thank you, and enjoy talking to each of you.
All right, excellent. And so I think Dave Gardner, to round out our North American participants, why don't you go next, and then we'll move on to Australia.
Well, let's see if you can hear me first.
Yep,
can
we
you?
can hear you.
Excellent. So as I think about this whole supply chain issue, I think a lot about the whole issue of customization and rationalizing your supply chain to enable you to offer configurable products. And many companies today probably aren't thinking that way, but it should be more than just a tactical move about how to keep supplies on hand. I think it should also be how to better address customer needs globally, not just locally. And so that would be one of the perspectives that I'd like to have us discuss a bit today in this meeting, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you. Excellent.
Very good. Well, with that said, then we'll move on to Australia. So Evan, from your perspective, which entails both finance and manufacturing and supply chain.
Yep. Thank you very much, Lisa, and good morning from Australia. Look, I come at it from a perspective of I grew up in my family's manufacturing business, and I've been advising clients on the buying, selling, and growing of manufacturing businesses for 25 years. And I think there might be talk of reshoring. I'm just not sure there's an appetite in our country to do it, or even the possibility to do it. Many of our industries have left us. Car manufacturing's gone. We've put defence manufacturing in its place so we can at least protect ourselves, but I don't think that's coming back. And we've got this interesting dynamic that we've got our two biggest trading partners are China and the US. It's a delicate balance for us in Australia in terms of what we do going forward. China buys a lot from us. We've got an interesting position to play. And as Australians, I think we do it rather well, both from a political and an economic point of view. But it requires us to be diplomatic.
always helps.
Mm.
All right, so David, how about you? You have a not only supply chain background, but are heavy in ERP and the systems and technology that we utilize as well.
Certainly. Well, thank you, Lisa. I would endorse Evan's comments about the current situation here in Australia. I'm not 100% sure that we have the political will to be able to reshore a lot of the manufacturing and so forth back into this country. I think Australia, by its nature, has got a difficult landscape to navigate, in that we have a small population in relation to the rest of the world. But our manufacturers here have got a broad range of requirements from a functional perspective. They have to be able to do many things for the small number of customers that they do. So unlike America, where an organization can specialize in that, Australia doesn't have that luxury to be able to do that. And that adds extra complexity to their decisions around reshoring and so forth. I guess for me, the fundamentals are making sure that you've got the right business habits and metrics and mindsets and things in place. And that's the beginning of it all. So, and clearly the use of technology. But I'm with Evan in many ways that, while it would probably be good for Australia to be able to reshore a lot of our manufacturing, I'm not 100% sure it's actually going to happen.
Well, and that leads to an interesting perspective, and that's a good time to make a plug to listen to our next panel, because we're going to talk about it from the European perspective as well as the North American perspective. So stay tuned for part 2. With that said, though, in the U.S. And North America, I think we are absolutely seeing action as it comes to reshoring. So it's like you said, there's an interesting conundrum to be walking. But with that said, China has vast infrastructure set up for manufacturing. So it's not as though that's going to turn off, within a day by any means. So, I think maybe we'll explore next. What are each of us seeing as far as like the reasons, I guess, let's start with North America, but the reasons that we're seeing clients move to reshoring? Is it, what's really behind this? Is it COVID? Is it the tariffs, or is it something else? So Rick, what are you seeing? Like, why are they moving to these, why are they reevaluating their sourcing network for your clients?
I think most of my clients, which tend to be middle market sized companies, are reshoring for a couple of reasons. The main one of which is to shorten their supply chains so that they can respond more quickly to changes in demand and changes in designs and things of that nature that are being driven by the customer. So it's really more of a customer responsiveness. And I think the second reason they're doing it is because when they originally offshored, they did it as a cost reduction tool. And what they're discovering is when they take a look at the total cost of ownership, that it in fact is not cheaper necessarily to build your product offshore once you consider all the inventory and ocean time and quality issues and customer service issues and that kind of thing. So I think they've changed their perspective on how to decide where to manufacture products. And that perspective includes a much stronger view of what customer requirements might be.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I remember when I was a vice president of operations and supply chain, how many times can you imagine that the board asked me to cut back on labor costs when material costs and freight costs were a much bigger percentage of the total? So it's no wonder that a lot of companies went we're looking at labor costs singularly, I guess is the right word, instead of looking at the total picture. But I see the same, Rick, that lots of people are starting to look at the total picture, and the tariffs and COVID are like pushing them over the edge, if you will, to get moving. And Diane, I know you brought
Lisa?
Oh, go ahead, Dave.
I was just going to offer that part of it is the standard costing model that we use in manufacturing really grossly distorts cost. And if we're going to start looking at this more appropriately, we really have to pursue activity-based costing and look at total cost, latent cost of getting parts. So let me give you an example. when I was a VP of product management for a fire truck manufacturer, our corporate purchasing people in Illinois said, well, we're going to go get all these really big, heavy, expensive sheet metal parts made up in Ohio, and then we'll just ship them to Florida for final assembly. Well, the problem was that we were a craft production company, and we weren't very stable in terms of demand or exactly what we wanted our demand to look like. So we were kind of stuck with these very heavy items and nobody to really support us in the process. Plus the fact they didn't consider all the freight in, adding to total cost, and the freight back out to get things reworked. And so the standard costing model says, oh yeah, we're saving money. And of course, purchasing was evaluated based on PPV and against standard. And of course, that was a gross distortion of what the actual costs were. So maybe some of the other people here on the panel could discuss this point. But I think that the standard costing, which has been around for 110 years or so here in the U.S., it may be a model that's kind of obsolete.
Yeah, I have definitely found that just simply avoiding double counting costs is sometimes tricky to do. But you're right, the standard cost approach oftentimes leads people to the wrong decisions. That doesn't necessarily mean, in my opinion, though, that it's that it's bad. It's how you're looking at it, and if you're really looking at costs in the right way, or are you just allocating overhead or whatever. So anyway, yeah, that's a good point. We definitely can pursue that one further, and maybe from that point of view, Evan, we should ask you what you think, since you have a finance background here. What do you find?
I mean, I'm listening to you guys going, well, probably the world we come from a little bit, the ultimate measure for us is money in the bank in terms of what we're doing. So, I think some of the things you're talking about are logistical kind of or strategic decision making that's got lost in a chain of command, whereas our businesses are probably flatter in their structures because they're necessarily smaller. And so you feel these poor decisions quickly because your money starts running out. And so you got to correct them. I think we probably think, I think of it more like a negotiation and a strategist point of view. Whatever we're doing, you want to make sure you've got more than one way in terms of the product that you're making, if you can help it. We have certainly experienced in this country where China goes, just switches us off.
Right. Yeah, like Amazon can do that too.
Yeah, well, I mean, they get a bit upset with, how we might want to investigate the, COVID, and then so they just strategically stop a few of our industries from importing to them. And, it's a quid pro quo, no doubt.
Well, and that actually brings up the matter of control, which might be another reason. However, I don't know, Rick, I saw you took yourself off of mute. Did you have something to say on the cost topic?
Yeah, it's many years ago when I was hired to be VP of Ops of a manufacturer, one of the first things I did was disband the cost accounting department. And we had a very forward-looking CFO, and he implemented a contribution margin / direct costing system. And it changed our world. I mean, it changed where our priorities were. It changed how we save money. Over a period of time, this manufacturer grew 5x in 5 years, and we went from a break even to a 23% profit before tax. And there was a number of reasons for that, but one of the big contributors was the new cost accounting system and how it got people really focused on the direct cost of manufacture and stopping allocating uncontrollable costs, at least in manufacturing, such as IT. And it really changed the way we did. So I think Dave's point is really excellent, that you really have to change the way you think. And I think with reshoring, that's part of it, is your perspective on how things move and how the supply chain works is really changing.
Yeah, you bring up memories, because I had in a turnaround situation where I was in as well as a VP of Ops, we did the same. We looked at contribution margins, and it really brought us from, well, not making money to making, having significant margins. And of course, it's never like one cost accounting method that somehow turns around the company, but it's the idea of looking at those metrics and what are we contributing to the bottom line. So you bring up actually somewhat like stressful memories as well as happy memories.
Lisa, that's kind of why I started with business habits and mindsets at the very beginning, because it's the way you look at things that can make a big difference. Like, I mean, the cost of holding inventory, for example, is often ignored by a lot of companies, and it needs to be something that needs to be accounted for, because under this post-COVID world, all of a sudden everybody's starting to just put in massive amounts of buffer inventory everywhere as a knee-jerk reaction to not being able to get supply, rather than fully understanding the logic behind the philosophies that we use, and the costing element influences those decisions. Rather than fully understanding it is, and devising your strategy based on that proper understanding.
I would just suggest, mate, that right now, supply chains got through into absolute bloody chaos, and the only reaction is to stockpile key components or raw materials in your manufacturing business. And quite frankly, those that got a bit lucky and found peak demand and had deep pockets did well. Sometimes that was government, anointed by saying, you're now the supplier for this, particularly PPE and hand sanitizer. I mean, you're a CEO or a business owner, you're watching that go on, you're going into sort of crisis tactical mode. I think, as much money as you've got might be thrown into key raw materials. Everything we have goes there because we know we're going to sell it.
Yeah, I think it kind of leads us into one of the gut reactions to all this is, let's bring on the inventory, and we have this massive bullwhip effect that's starting to take place where people overreact through the supply chain one way or another, and now we have stuffed warehouses and whatnot else. Diane,
I think it depends on how COVID treated these companies or these organizations. Some may have, it smacked them in the face and they realize I have an issue and we have to take some action here. Whereas I have other clients who were proactive or have been proactive and working on what other sourcing options are out there. And maybe it's Vietnam, or it's the Philippines, or it's Mexico. But I think if you were significantly disrupted, or some of the trends prior to COVID were tariffs. I know clients of mine were already thinking about this, or it was on top of mind because of the tariffs and what they could do about it.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was gonna go ahead, Devin.
Sorry, David, do you think it was here prior, reshoring in Australia?
Yeah, was it a trend prior to?
Do you think?
I think the realization that the total cost of ownership, when you look at the extended supply chain that Rick mentioned before, the quality issues that were occurring, the fact that China wasn't easy to deal with returns, the whole cost part of that was falling, the dawning on people in Australia. I don't think there's any doubt that people had realised that China wasn't the panacea and it was only labour cost driven. That was an awareness, but whether they can do something about that here in Australia is a question, because our energy prices are very high. There are a lot of the components to the cost of doing it here will mean that it's going to be significantly more expensive. And let's be honest, at the end of the day, the consumer is price driven. And that's what's driven all of these companies to do that. And I think in many ways, whether consumer behaviour changes or not, but that's what's going to be driving it at the end of the day.
Well, go ahead, Evan.
My take on that is that there's a bit of sentiment for it at the moment in the marketplace from a consumer point of view. But I don't think it's real. I think as soon as this settles down and they're given a choice again between you can get it from China and it's $3, you can have it Australian made and at $6, they will make it, they'll vote with their wallet. I don't think it'll change a thing.
Yeah, well, and that brings up a point, and I was going to bring this up earlier because Diane, you mentioned e-commerce. We're even pre-COVID, we're seeing pretty dramatic ramp ups in e-commerce, which drives with it some pretty extreme requirements as it relates to the customers and delivery responsiveness. So, what were you seeing in terms of that segment?
Well, I think that the trends were there for e-commerce, and so clients started back to what Rick mentioned, the responsiveness and how complex the supply chain can get, and are you able to supply your customers, and maybe that in the entire equation of total costs, you don't want to have the stockouts. You want to make sure you have it covered. So I think the trends here, at least for clients I'm working with, e-commerce actually was on the horizon prior to the whole COVID disruption, and it's certainly driving the behavior.
Yeah, I'm seeing it drive a significant need for responsiveness, and now folks are thinking about technology and how do they, I don't know, how do they do mass customization quickly? And Dave could probably talk more about that. But how do we also do maybe 3D printing, additive manufacturing, or what do we need to be doing to position closer to our customers, yet at the same time be more flexible and resilient, but still keep the cost down? So, I mean, Rick, are you finding any of that?
Yeah, I agree with that, completely. One of the questions we happen to have in the Q&A box right now is whether, some industries should wait to reshore. And I think, kind of related to this, that in my opinion, you never wait for anything. You keep moving. Sometimes you move slower and other times you move faster, but I think your customers, are always moving, and they're always, hopefully buying. And so I think we've got to continuously be responsive to them. So it's something that I think has to be in the forefront of the mind all the time.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think that companies cannot wait. They at least need to be reevaluating their supply chain and their risk, and looking at key customers, key risks areas, and doing something about that. At least that's what I'm finding. For example, I have a client that was moving to Vietnam already pre-tariffs, because they are thinking in advance. And boy, were they lucky that they did that, because they saved millions of dollars by making that transition. And now, even though they were in Vietnam and COVID's hit, they're thinking, even though it would add cost of the product, well, let's put it this way. They have two options. They're thinking about increasing their presence in Mexico, because that could help them while still maintaining lower costs, because they do have a little bit of a labor intensive product, as well as maybe they need to actually go to the US as well, purely from a responsiveness point of view. So they're thinking about dual paths. So I think, smart companies are thinking forward is what I'm seeing. Does anybody else have anything else about that question? And there's some others in the chat box.
I was just going to add, Lisa, I did some research prior to, and there was a Gartner survey, and it was March of this year, so right as COVID was beginning. But the survey said at least 33% of those supply chain leaders surveyed have organizations who are taking steps or will be in the next 3 years taking steps out of China. So there's a trend, and there are companies taking action today.
Yeah, well, and actually, I've led several other webinars for different series with a global expert that's specifically focused on China. And there's some other reasons as well that have been coming up. So like in December of last year, there was a new IP law that went into effect in China. And basically, if anything goes through a server in China, which is pretty much 100% of everything, then the government can decide to read whatever it wants. So that's like, could be problematic for several clients. So anyway, there's a lot of things coming up that have to be thought through. Let's see, we have a question here from Art about, he's talking about cost centers versus enterprise accounting, and how does this equate to Eli Goldrat's The Goal? Does anybody have wants to tackle this question?
Nope.
Art, you have to give us a tricky one here. Well, you know, Eli Goldrat's and the goal is really more about what is that name of that philosophy? Somebody help me. It's gosh, it'll come.
Q theory.
Yes, thank you.
Theory of constraints.
There you go. So it's really the more the theory of constraints, and how you it kind of, in my mind anyway, goes with what we're talking about, like the uncommon common sense way of looking at cost accounting and tying it to the theory of constraints, where you're looking at where are your bottlenecks. That's, you know, that would be my answer to that
Well,
question is
in many ways, it gets back to what Dave mentioned before about activity-based costing, right?
right.
And the difficulty with activity-based costing is not a lot of the accounting fraternity, so the CFOs in the world aren't really across it and don't fully understand the philosophy. So that gets back to my point before about understanding philosophies and mindsets of the businesses. So there's got to be a political will within the business to want to be able to do something with activity-based costing. It comes with a significantly different level of workload for different people. You need to configure ERP systems to capture the costs and transactions in a different way. So it's not an easy sell. And I think that's potentially another one of the barriers to making this resiliency and understanding of costs better more difficult to achieve, because there's so much prep work that's got to go on to make these things work properly.
Yeah.
Oh, David, I'll tell you, it was a horrific effort for us at the fire truck company to make this transition. And we actually ran in parallel for a while, and they wanted us to prove out that we weren't going to artificially depress costs and inflate margins and do all kinds of crazy things. So, I mean, it was a very, very perilous kind of thing to do. But when you think about a fire truck that costs $125,000 and takes, 2 weeks to build, versus an airport rescue firefighting vehicle that might take, 6 months, and you think about all your overhead gets absorbed at the same level, even though the level of complexity and cost and everything is wildly different. Once you begin to lay out these arguments for even the CFOs, they begin to realize, maybe there is something that we're not seeing here. And part of it is this whole standard costing thing. Accountants tend to be a little more conservative and don't want to take any risk. On the other hand, if you can engage with them, so I had in the product management group, I had 2 financial controllers to help me analyze all this information, communicate back to the financial people so that they got an early warning system in terms of what was going on, rather than just surprising them with a month-end report or something else. And so it's a change management issue, but I think it's something that's really, really important. One other thing I was going to bring up, and the story is fairly old. It has to do with Japan and how Japan has a fairly small market on an island and how they have made themselves into a global powerhouse. And it's not by doing exactly the same thing for every customer in the world. So they have different configurations. They sell to the Middle East and to Europe and the US and other places. And so they've done it through diversification of the same basic products, not through making everything the same. And I think if I think about Australia, maybe you're kind of in the same boat where you're an island with 25 million people. We have 40 million here in California. Of course, California is the 5th largest economy in the world by itself. But the point is that there are probably some real serious opportunities in certain industries that you could tackle and be very, very successful, but you have to get very close to the customers and know what they want not just sit back and second guess. And that's where this whole issue of product management, I think, comes in. It's where you get voice of the customer, you have really close engagement with customers, you're forward thinking, you're not just kind of living with blinders on. Very, very important function that's going to be, I see an ever increasing need here in the next 10, 15, 20 years, particularly here in America.
Dave, I would suggest to you that in the last 20 years, we've watched a lot of manufacturing go over to China, and the only way you could survive as a manufacturer is build really clever stuff, bespoke stuff, and have a worldwide market, because you can't, the domestic market will not support you. I would say that we have many, many examples of some wonderful Australian companies, but they are all smart, high-end manufacturers. You know,
Cochlear, for example.
Sure.
Cochlear implants for the deaf. Like, I mean, they manufacture some of that here, but it's very high-end, very niche product, very smart product, and they export it to the world. And there's no question about that, Dave. I think that's where the focus for Australia needs to be, whether we make some use of adaptive methodology, manufacturing or not.
Well, and actually some of that's, I see that same thing happening in places like California, because we're not exactly the least expensive state to produce in, that's for sure. So, I see that happening here. And I see, Rick, you had
I wanted to make a comment on the Eli Goldratt thing. Much like the supply chain, the shortcoming of the theory of constraints is that it tends to focus inside the process. It tends to focus, I had a client once that was a metal fabricator, and we knew that the constraint in manufacturing was the welding cell. And so they went out and got robots and all kinds of things to try to improve the welding cell. Well, then we took a Toyota Kata perspective on it and discovered that the real constraint in the system was in the customer service department, and before the order ever even got released to the floor. And I think one of the shortcomings of the theory of constraints is that you have to really open your perspective and take a much broader system view. Almost, if you remember the old book, The Fifth Discipline, taking a look at things as a total system. And I think as you try to improve your supply chain and decide whether you should do reshoring or not, or regionalization or not, or whatever, you've really got to take a look at the entire system, from your customer's customer to your supplier's supplier, and see how it's flowing. And one of the questions had to do with lean. And of course, lean is not about cost reduction, it's about flow. And I think flow throughout the entire system is really the key component that we have to keep an eye on.
Well, it's like blood flow, isn't it? Because if the blood doesn't flow, the business doesn't live.
That's correct.
And that's where I was going to go with this, is that, well, actually, lean was next on the list because we have questions about lean. But also, I see lean, I see theories, a lot of these concepts, even the cost accounting, the activity-based costing, I've seen clients that were the most successful in making the transition didn't necessarily do the across the board, like let's introduce this massively complex activity-based costing program. Not that some people couldn't be very successful, but instead they use like a uncommon common sense. Let's look at the critical components. It kind of combines a lot of these concepts together. And so that's where I was going to go with lean, is that I see I don't see lean as in conflict with JIT, or lean as in conflict now that we have COVID. It's, some of the underlying concepts that definitely not every manufacturer has followed, however, but the underlying concepts aren't bad. Like Rick's saying, their flow, paying attention to your customers' requirements, like eliminating waste along the way. None of those things are bad, but it's if you take any of these things to an extreme where it gets to be a problem.
Right. Or don't fully understand them, as I mentioned before, right? It's understanding where they fit in the overall picture that really matters, and how to apply them to your particular circumstance. One of the things about being agile, of course, is being able to manipulate or mold those philosophies to suit the circumstances that you're in.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead,
And
Diane.
I was just going to say, Rick, well, through this discussion, Rick reminded me earlier today, I was on a client SIOP, sales inventory and operations planning call, and the conversation came around, supplier performance and what kind of, schedule or what information are they able to provide their supplier? And it just tells you, your supplier can be anywhere. They can be close, they can be far, but if you're not providing them the right information and the right requirements, they're not going to do well. So it does go back to process and some of the basics here, even though other things have changed.
And that's what I mentioned before. It's about the basics 101 type stuff. In my supply chain model, I've got a 5V model, and the first V is visibility. What visibility do you have in your own business? What visibility do you have into the other parts of the supply chain, into your suppliers? What visibility do you have into their suppliers? It's really just, it's not simple, but it's not easy. Sorry, it is simple, but it's not easy.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, what does the panel think? I'm curious as well. Do you think that more of your clients are going to stock up at least on strategic inventory, whether that's raws or finished goods or whatnot, at least near term? Have they gone too low? What are you seeing in your clients?
I think
My
they already
clients,
have.
a lot of
No,
are
go ahead,
loosening
Rick. You start
their
first.
inventory policies a little bit, and they're mitigating risk by increasing their stocking levels. And I think as David or somebody mentioned in our discussion the other day about lean, that's part of the reason that you have supermarkets is to make sure that you don't run out. And so I think what I'm seeing in my clients is they're loosening up their policies a little bit. They're still quite concerned about cash flow and working capital, but they're more concerned about running out right now because of so many variables and unknowns in the COVID world.
Yeah, I would agree. I have a client, a lawn and garden equipment tools client, and that they're going to hold the strategic inventory on certain products because they were caught with some stock outs and kind of reaction mode this entire year. So they're going to take the opposite approach here and try to mitigate those.
Yeah, at least for the key, so
Just
they
on
can keep key customers. Yeah,
exactly.
and stay resilient. Although, Rick, something you said reminded me, I have this client that I was working with that's a drone manufacturer, and they had a lot of inventory, if you will, but it's always dependent on what the inventory is in. And so their real problem was figuring out what would be sold so that they could actually use the inventory they had to make something that was useful. So really, in that case, we were really looking at implementing sales and operations planning, but also looking at the supply base and figuring out what's in common amongst products, what could we rely upon. And we found that there was a whole lot more in common on an engineer to order type product than was thought, so that we could actually over time reduce inventory and actually speed up our lead times pretty significantly. So I think that there's a lot of ways to slice the equation, I guess you could say.
Yeah. No, I think that part rationalization is something that a lot of my clients are doing now. They're re-examining all of their parts and trying to decide which ones they want to keep and which ones they want to divest. And that's actually helping reduce inventories, but it's allowing them to increase inventory on the key parts, like you mentioned, but reduce inventory overall. And so again, I think it takes a pretty broad systemic view to really do that right.
Well, and what I'm noticing is that it's the opportunity, because clients and customers are more accepting of scaling back the number of items and configurations of items, because they're, with COVID, they've become accepting of this. So all of the, we all know from at least in the US, the restaurants have scaled back on options. But that's happened throughout the food supply chain, because I work with several food manufacturers or processors, and they're all scaling back the number of options, which helps their helps their overall equation. At the same time, their customers are accepting so far. We'll see what happens in the future. So
Yeah.
anyway, go ahead. Were you going to say something, Rick?
No.
Okay. Now, Becky has a question for us. Is the main driver for considering reshoring cost, speed, or strategic domestic supplies for some items like defense and healthcare?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I don't know. Like my clients have all these reasons. Thank you for the softball question, Becky. No, I'm seeing the same. I mean, they have all of the above is driving. I think any one of those has driven specific clients to think about the issue, but then once they start looking at it, and especially with COVID, now it's like brought them all up, it seems. So actually, from that point of view, I think that our audience would be interested in where we're seeing folks go. Are we, so in North America, we're talking more about reshoring than in Australia, it's more of a careful management of suppliers. Although I do remember being on a call, I can't remember if it was David or Evan, but you guys mentioned potential new sources of supply as well. So here I'm seeing clients specifically look at Mexico, let's say, for higher labor composed products, if you will. And they're looking at the US, but they're also looking at Central and South America. I see more and more of that, like Brazil as an example. I think one of my suppliers was telling me earlier today, or clients was telling me earlier today, they're moving their source of supply to Brazil. Well, that's right. I remember now. It was a granite, like countertops kind of manufacturer, and they actually got everything from China, but China like cut them off. Like they had all sorts of issues, and then they were moving most of it, or a lot of it, to Brazil. So where are you guys seeing? Are you seeing your clients move to other places like Vietnam, India? Those come up a lot.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. Diane, what are you seeing? Yes.
I was going to say that, yeah, all the same. Vietnam and India are coming up amongst all my clients, or commonality between clients.
If they have a higher labor.
Yeah, exactly. But like you said, Mexico as well, just because it is closer to the US market. So for speed purposes, they're going, or at least looking at Mexico.
Now, David and Evan, I think one of you guys, I can't remember which one, mentioned something like you may actually start considering Mexico more as well as one of your.
Yeah, I mentioned that the other day because Mexico really doesn't naturally fall into our thought patterns in many ways, I guess, because there's not a lot of logistic channels to that part of the globe to Australia at the moment. Obviously, China, Vietnam, there's lots of shipping routes and lots of logistic channels there already. But, I think Australians need to take the blinkers off a little and potentially need to start looking across the Pacific a bit more because that could give us much better opportunities than maybe some of the Asian countries.
Interesting. Now, Rick, are you seeing any differences to any of this, or are you seeing the same?
Yes, I'm seeing more people going north and south rather than east and west. And
I like it.
One in particular is in the clothing industry, and where they are going to Brazil and even Uruguay and a couple of the other ones in South America, and a little bit in Costa Rica and such as that. But the nice part of it is this particular client, and Dave, you might appreciate this, that this particular client does a tremendous amount of customization for their customers. And so they have to have very timely communication, both with their designers and with the production environment. And when you go north and south, you tend to be 1 or 2 time zones different rather than 12. And it makes it much, much easier to communicate and deal with it. And the transportation is actually a little bit faster as well.
Yep.
Yeah, really good point. Actually, I've seen Costa Rica. I actually visited Costa Rica and saw some of the facilities. They actually have a pretty decent, center, if you will. But I'm hearing more about that recently again as well, which I think is kind of good because I like to visit Costa Rica. So. As an aside, let's see. We have Art had another question here. Let's see. What's the best method or process? You know, Art's always giving us doozies, so we'll see. What's the best method or process to calculate the total cost of ownership? And how do you get all of senior leadership to agree on the same calculation? Well, that is a trick. So does anyone want to take it, or I'll, you know, I can.
Yeah, Art, I don't have a magic wand.
Well, as
I
far
think
as,
one of the things you
go
have
ahead,
to
Dave.
do is ask your customers what they view as total cost of ownership. So a lot of times we don't think about the simplest thing, but sometimes the simplest thing is go talk to the customers. What are the impacts that they're seeing in warranty costs and downtime and other types of things, RMA cycles, you know, all those cycle times. Those are all things that mean a lot to customers. And so, you know, I've always found that if you can rally things from a customer's perspective, it's easier to sell to the organization than if you just say, it's my opinion that such and such is the case.
Yeah, they're actually quite good at that in aerospace, because they're always looking up and down the supply chain and getting inputs. So that's a good point. And I think you know, it's really calculating or including all of the key components. So the way I see it is the way I see almost everything, though, is uncommon common sense, take the directional view, 80-20, whatever you want to call it. But basically, you know, if freight is a key component in your industry, like in one of my past lives, we shipped adult diapers. Well, they're very fluffy and big, not heavy, but fluffy. So freight is kind of important. Another thing there is material costs, because that was another key component. So, you know, I would make sure that you're thinking through all of the material costs. At least you start there, and then you can always get to perfection later. You know, landed costs. It's not always just about that. And by all means, if Art was on this panel, I know he's on the next one, but he would absolutely bring up inventory carrying cost. So as we, you know, several of us have a passion for that. So
Yes.
exactly.
When I look at
Go
this,
ahead.
you know, to me, the you know, key words here are total cost. And so to me, there's pre-transaction costs, transaction costs, and post-transaction costs. And a lot of what we've talked about, you know, in terms of warranty and returns and so on, are post-transaction costs. You know, the transaction costs are costs of issuing the purchase orders and actually building the product, that kind of thing. But the pre-transaction costs, which a lot of companies, you know, other than the big pharmaceuticals, tend to sweep under the rug, is product development. And in particular, when you go to someplace like China, you typically have to put an engineer on an airplane to have him go over there and qualify a tool or qualify first production parts or something like that. And there's oftentimes a fairly significant cost associated with that a lot of companies don't include in the total cost of ownership.
Yep.
So I think
very
the
good point.
total cost is to include all the costs.
You're right. And think about
But
all
Rick,
the, like,
to your point,
go ahead, Dave.
Rick, to your point, so that's really a production engineering type cost, but it's usually a cost borne by product development. So it really distorts what you think you're getting in terms of the innovation side of the business, because it's more about getting something into production.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that always bothered me a lot, because of the margin, overall margins, gross margins for the company, but I think it distorts cost in a profound way.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I think, you know, it's sometimes hard to think of all the different costs. So at least think of the key categories, and then it'll get you started looking at the costs. A lot of the ERP systems, at least the modern ones, include several of these, so it makes it easier on you. But don't worry about all this complexity. At least that's what I think. Just like start and think about this and say, does this really make sense? Because like Rick was saying, there was a client story I had that was moving to Mexico, which is closer to us, but they had to spend like a insane amount of money moving engineers back and forth, because it's somewhat of a highly technical product. And it by the time they were able to get it coming off the lines in the fashion they wanted, it was massively underestimated. So, and it was still not providing the level of service they wanted. Now, that's not to say there was anything wrong with Mexico or something. It's just that you oftentimes underestimate. And so I think that is the idea, is, think about what we're doing here. Now, let's see, since we have just 5 minutes left, let's maybe do one wrap up. Like if we were to think about anything related to reshoring that we want to make sure that our clients are thinking about in advance, or a trend that we think is noteworthy, I'll go around to the group, and then we're going to wrap up with a bonus for everyone that's attended today that we just hot off the press. So with that said, let's I don't know, let's start with Evan. What are you a parting thought, if you will?
I mean, I think Australia will continue to manufacture your high-end smart stuff, and will continue to have to buy in, mass-produced things. Strategically, though, as a country, I think we need to think about, our pharmaceutical industry. We divested ourselves of that, in the last 20 or 30 years, and most of that infrastructure is now making soap or something. And it would be, I think that has been highlighted for our country in terms of, most of the base material for all our pharmaceuticals does come from China.
Very good. All right. Well, sticking to Australia and the PAC Rim Zone, David, how about you?
I guess as a summary, I think it's time for everybody to review their strategies, because clearly the strategies they had before COVID are not going to work post-COVID. So that's the first place to start, I think, is to review all the strategic thinking that you've been doing. I would be reviewing some of your basics 101, having good basic business habits, looking at the visibility and velocity of material and information and how you're handling those sorts of things. You get those things in place, and then new things fall out from that. So, resiliency in your supply chain is definitely possible, but it just starts with that new strategy, I think.
All right. How about Dave Gardner? What thought do you have?
I was just going to say, I think the most important thing you can do at this point is, if you're thinking about reshoring, is think about how you can raise the bar in your own organization and better connect with your customers for longevity and resiliency in that way. For my money, that's the real opportunity. It's just not about taking something from China and moving it to Vietnam or some other places. How do you get more competitive? How do you become more differentiated?
Yeah, absolutely. Rick,
and thank you for the people who joined us today, and to my fellow panelists.
Very good. All right. So Rick, how about you?
Well, to me, reshoring is one arrow in your quiver. And whether you use it or not is really a function of what your overall supply chain strategy is. And that should be a function of your overall business strategy. And so it's really important to start with the business, which typically starts with the customer, and figure out where it is that you're going with that, and then develop your overall supply chain strategy, and then decide if the reshoring is the arrow that you want to shoot. And yep. So I think if you take an overall strategic view of it, reshoring becomes much easier to decide whether and how to implement.
That's true. It is really just one of many concepts, but it's certainly the hot topic. So Diane, it's tough to be in the last position here, but do you see anything to add to the?
I would say I echo each of the panelists, last thought. I would say overall, I am seeing that there is momentum out of China into other lower cost regions. So it's definitely a trend that's going to continue to some extent. And I think overall, to Rick's point, what can you do to think about the strategy? What can you do on, assessing risk? How resilient is your supply chain? And have you assessed what kind of disruptions your supply chain can withstand? I would be thinking about all of those questions.
Very good. And I would wrap up with, I did a webinar recently for a group on efficiency versus resiliency. And I think that that's really what we need to be thinking about, is actually not efficiency versus resiliency, but how do we achieve similar to
Oh.
what Rick said, efficiency and resiliency to be successful over the long term. So, so with that said, then this group of panelists, as well as our part 2 panelists, which are going to be coming up on November 11th, remember to sign up for that. We have a surprise bonus for you. We have put together the first in a series of ebooks on the supply chain. And our first ebook is available. We will send out a link to those of you that are attending today. And each of us will have it on our websites as well, but it's called Thriving in the New Business Environment, Why the Strategic Supply Chain Matters. And, you know, we go ahead and get your free download. We will send out a link to everyone. And, you know, stay tuned and also let us know what topics are going to make a difference to your business in the future. And let us know, because we are, this is our first of our series. And this is also the first of our panel discussion series. We have consultants from around the world, the top consultants getting together. And what would you like to hear from us? Let us know.
Yep.
So with that said, I would like to thank our panelists today, and you know, download our ebook and stay tuned for our next panel. Thank you.